Jack, why don't we go straight to, no. Yeah, we're going to do, yes. We have our fiduciary council with us, Mr. Lederman and Ms. Poe. Welcome. It's nice to see both of you in this role and formalized and new relationship, and we're looking forward to really some support that you can provide us. So you're going to start with your fiduciary training for us. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, and we're very happy to be here. Harvey Lederman and Sandra Poe from Reed Smith. We have a few slides up on the board. I take it that, or I hope that since we're not upstairs in the Learning Center, that's not an indication that there won't be any learning going on. Good one. I didn't know if that's where all learning must take place.
I heard the teacher voice going, Harvey, we're okay.
We're good. So what we really want to do with you today, this is fiduciary education. Well, we really want to engage with you on this, or around this thought. And we've titled it Charting a Steady Fiduciary Course Through Stormy Seas. I'm going to try not to belabor the ocean metaphors, and there aren't any pictures of boats or ships or ports or anything in here. No, I don't think there are. But we really want to do, the theme here really is going to be this. Fiduciary duties, for trustees, especially of public pension funds, has been pretty constant and stable for a very long time. The law and the standards of it, and most of you who have been through annual programs and other programs across the country are probably tired of hearing about the fiduciary duties constantly. But what we want to try to emphasize for you is that those standards are essentially a guidance system to carry you through circumstances that keep changing on you. Just when you think that you've got some things in place, the circumstances then change on you, and you're presented with a whole new set of challenges. So what we really want to engage with you on are, let's talk about the fundamental fiduciary duties and what they are, what that guidance system is, and then let's talk about what causes our seas to be choppy. And I sent earlier, when I sent that email to the board earlier called a fiduciary focus view, I attached some scenarios that we're going to talk about. I hope you had an opportunity. We'll put them up on the screen. You may have had an opportunity to look through those and really spend some time thinking about those cross currents that take place that we have to bring these fiduciary responsibilities to. So let's see if that works. So again, forgive a few of the nautical allusions here, but as I say, we need to apply these duties to a multitude of changing circumstances, and we're going to be exploring that. There's one phrase that appears in the Constitution, appears in what they call the Restatement of Trusts, it appears in ERISA, all of these analogous statements that we're really going to focus on today. And that is that a prudent trustee exercises judgment under the circumstances then prevailing. And it's an incredibly important phrase because the circumstances change, as we'll talk about. And you can't simply file and forget. You have a policy manual, you have all these other policies, you have risk factors, you have a divestment policy. We can't just put those on the shelf and leave them alone. They have to be taken out. New life has to be breathed into them as you go forward under the circumstances then prevailing. What are the circumstances that we're currently faced with? We've tried to list a few, and please, questions, anything that comes to mind. If you have other things that you believe are also what I call cross currents and riptides that are affecting the stewardship of this board and the system, let's talk about them as well. But let's just talk about where we are in the markets. We know we're post-recession, right? Post the Great Recession. We don't know what we're pre exactly. We're kind of in this period, and if you listen to all the investment consultants, everybody's hedging their bets, and everybody says, well, I don't know what the market, what is the Fed going to do with the rate, and is the economy booming? As the Wall Street Journal said today, the bond market is strong, or isn't it strong? So we really don't know. We're in that period of time of great uncertainty. We know what disaster looked like 6 years ago. We don't know what's coming in the future. We have volatile global markets. Somebody cuts a deal or doesn't cut a deal in Iran, in Greece. It's going to affect our investment portfolio. We need to be prepared for that. We're talking about de-risking the portfolio. We had a big conversation this morning about ESG and sustainability. What are the risks and opportunities that are coming out of climate change, for example? How do we embrace those? How do fiduciaries bring that guidance system of fiduciary responsibility into these areas? AB 1469 increased contribution rates, in some cases for our district participants, rather substantially. That's another cross current that we have to deal with. One of the issues are going to be the capability of all of our districts to be able to meet those increased contributions going forward. That's something that you will take your fiduciary role into that context and try to weigh the situation. Few more. We know that our member demographics are changing just simply by mortality rates. That is changing finance assumptions, the ability to pay the pensions, substantially. And how you react to that to prudently fund the system is going to be very important. Then coming from the sides, we have a whole bunch of other things, legislative propositions. We have one pending now about thermal coal. Okay, there's one. How are we going to deal with that? We have ballot measures. You know, we had this thing that was just filed last week. They said they were going to now try to qualify this new voter, can't remember what it's called exactly, Voter Empowerment Act of 2016. Has some impacts on the system, has some fiduciary impacts on the system that we need to deal with. So again, we are being acted upon by outside forces, and the job of fiduciaries is to steward the ship through these situations under the circumstances that are now prevailing. There is the constant drumbeat of threats to defined benefit plans, especially in the public sector. And recently, a few months ago, we had some pronouncements coming out of Detroit and out of Stockton, the city of Stockton bankruptcy, where assumptions that we've always made about the enforceability of vested pension rights and even the role of the pension fund as having standing in bankruptcy of our plan sponsors has now been tossed upside down. So we have to figure out what's the fiduciary reaction to that, if any. As I say, there are real threats there. There are some imagined threats. We talked this morning, this board did, with your advisors about sustainability. I'm going to throw out my definition of sustainability in terms of what we consider to be the board's responsibility on this slide. The obligation, and some of you enunciated this very clearly this morning, it's to sustain our ability to satisfy the obligations owed to members and beneficiaries through the prudent stewardship of trust assets over an indefinite period of time. That's the job. So why do we even raise this in this presentation? It's really because, this is the only picture I think I've got in here. It's really because fiduciary duties is a guidance system for you to use to maintain the balance and keep heading towards that goal. And I want to keep coming back to this. As you talk about things like ESG and opportunities and risks in the markets, come back to alignment with this. Does it promote achieving this goal, or is it tangential to it, or is it irrelevant to it? So as we go through this, we're going to be talking about how the fiduciary duties act essentially as a guidance system to keep you heading straight towards that goal. maybe we'll let Sandra take us from here. Let's get our grounding in fundamental fiduciary duties.
So your fundamental fiduciary duties, the first of those is the exclusive benefit rule, to use plan assets exclusively for the purposes of providing, paying the members promised retirement benefits. This came up many times this morning. I know you all know it because many of you talked about it this morning as your primary goal. Then there's the primary loyalty rule, to act always in the best interests of all members and beneficiaries, both current and future, and beneficiaries who are in different standings or state or parts of their career as they work through their relationship with the system. The primary loyalty rule drives, for example, in your policies and procedures, the policies that you have with regard to identifying conflicts of interest, areas of potential self-interest, and how you manage those, how you identify those, and then what you do with them once identified. In addition, you had just had a very robust, salutary conversation about balancing the interests of different types of beneficiaries of the system when you were talking about the positioning you might take on federal legislation about the windfall rule. There's also the primary care standard, and loyalty and care, those are the two sort of main buzzwords for fiduciaries. The primary care standard is to act under the circumstances then prevailing as would a prudent person in a like capacity and familiar with these matters in the conduct of an enterprise of like character and with like aims. Some of these words are unique to particularly pension plan and public plan fiduciaries. The care standard for you is a prudent expert standard. That's why we say a like capacity and having familiarity with the matters. And we talk about your peers when we talk about in the conduct of an enterprise with like character and like aims. Here, when we talk about the circumstances then prevailing, we're not, it's not a standard that requires you to predict the future or to try to endeavor to discover the future. It only implies that you ought to make sure that you stay well informed when you, in the context of making the decisions that you make. And you do this by developing information from experts, from staff, from consultants, from counsel, I hope, from public comment from your members, and from each other during the activities and the work of the boards and committees. So it's developing good information so to understand the prevailing circumstances in which you're making the decision.
The key here, if I may interject, is that this primary care standard is really a process standard. There's no expectation that all of you are going to be experts in everything that goes on, and you know that from all the reports that you get, because you get all those reports because you've delegated substantial responsibility to an expert staff and outside consultants, and they must report back to you. And so the process that you undergo is more important, frankly, than the results of that process, the ultimate decision that you make. You don't have to make a correct decision. That's going to be tested by time. But what you have to do is go through this process that makes you fundamentally an expert because you've developed expertise from the people that you're consulting with. We ought to talk, I guess, a little bit about, I know this may be on some of your mind, this recent Supreme Court decision that came down, the Tibble case.
Yes, the Tibble case addresses the Supreme Court decision in Tibble versus Edison, addresses trustees' duties of care when, particularly in the context of pension investment options. Unlike what some of the stories might have suggested, the Tibble case did not create a new standard or any new responsibilities for trustees. It did not change the care standard. The Supreme Court, it was merely telling the Ninth Circuit and the District Court that they had erred because in that case, the pension trustees had, there were actually a lot of pension trustee decisions at issue at the district court level, but what went up to the Supreme Court were there were 3 mutual funds where the trustees had offered in the plan where they had offered the retail class shares. There were many, many, many other mutual funds in the plan where they were offering institutional class shares, and I'm sure you know institutional class shares are much lower cost shares than retail class. And the plaintiffs were alleging that that the trustees had breached their duty with regard to never looking at it and making the decision to move from retail class to institutional class shares, and that and the problem with these particular 3 mutual funds is that the decision to put them in the plan had happened before the statute of limitations, so more than 6 years prior. So then the question came, during the time, so the initial decision to use those class shares was out of consideration because it was beyond the statute of limitations. So then the question was there some other breach? Was there some duty during that time to revisit the decision to use the retail class shares? And each of these funds had actually had some change of circumstances during the duration while they were in the pension plan. And the trustees had looked at that, but none of those events, those changes of circumstances, had specifically to do with share class choice. They had to do with other things that happened with mutual funds, name changes, some strategy changes. And the lower courts had decided, and Circuit Court affirmed, that the trustees were fine. They were nothing about those changes of circumstances made them look at the choice of share class. But the Supreme Court said, well, that's not a correct way of looking at a trustee's continuing standard of care. As trustees, it's not just about specific claps of thunder, moments in time, but it's really also generally a duty to monitor and to regularly visit decisions that have continuing impact. If the decision has continuing impact, then you have a continuing duty to monitor and think about them. And that's all the Supreme Court enunciated. So now it has to go back to the lower courts to decide whether there was the monitoring that happened during that period was sufficient, whether they should have looked at share class choice. But we won't really know whether the trustees had a breach during the 6 years by not making this change until now the district court goes back and relooks at the facts. So I just want to say that because people think the Supreme Court case enunciated some new standard of care. It didn't, but it does shed light on this duty that it's not just about when there's a specific major event, but really just about a duty to continuing to monitor.
So this was a decision that just came down about 3 weeks ago. And while it relates to an ERISA plan, a private ERISA plan, the standards of care there are essentially the same as we have here. And it's that constant duty to revisit and re-educate yourself and test your assumptions, because much of what you do, when the investment staff comes and makes capital, when you do your asset allocation study and you do a capital markets projection, you can't just leave it at that. The idea is you're going to come back in at least another 3 years and revisit those assumptions and see how you did and start truing up, if you will, to reality. This decision, it's quite unusual for the Supreme Court to come in with a unanimous decision this session, really reflects also the growing concern that the SEC has as well for plan fiduciaries in disclosing, in full disclosure, whether it's fees or how they make decisions. And again, it comes back to that process issue that you have to go through to assure that you are acting in a prudent manner.
And then like capacity and like aims means that when you look at measuring your conduct, you are meant to look at the conduct of trustees of comparable funds, but not non-comparable funds. And this actually also already came up this morning when you were looking at, I think, AXA and some other types of corporate entities. And, it's true that, your goals and what your fiduciary duties are supporting, the goal that your duties are supporting, are different than the goals of, say, a trustee of a foundation, endowment, or personal wealth trust. So you comport yourself differently. And I think that's one of the reasons why when large systems like CalSTRS act, we do see a lot of press and attention around it, because there are plenty of other fiduciaries who have this similar standard, who are, look to the leadership of the large influential systems to see maybe that's providing some guide for how they maybe ought to be acting. In addition, you have 2 other fundamental fiduciary duties. You have a duty to diversify investments in the portfolio, to minimize risk, maximize return. unless for some reason not diversifying is clearly more prudent. You obviously have a duty to follow the law, to adhere to your plan documents, the California Constitution, the teacher's retirement law, the Internal Revenue Code, trust law, and so on, and as well as your own policies, which for you have a similar force.
It's interesting, there was some conversation this morning, I think Paul raised the issue on the duty to diversify, and unless it's clearly not prudent to do so. I mean, California law, and in fact, ERISA itself as well, have fully subscribed to the theory of the modern portfolio theory on diversification and the efficient frontier, and that whole package. And it has never been retested to see whether that is the way that prudent fiduciaries ought to proceed with investment of the portfolio. But that is the standard, and I can't think of a situation where it's been tested in the courts or anywhere else where someone could prove that it was clearly not prudent to go in a different direction, or where it was clearly imprudent to diversify, is another way to put it. So that duty to diversify reads through the entire asset allocation approach to making the target that you wish to make. Now I'm going to throw out a few controversial ideas to you because, again, going through the choppy seas that you're engaged in, there are things that I call, these are other considerations that you take into account, but these are not within the panoply of fiduciary responsibilities. We talked, there was some reference this morning to minimizing employer contributions. That it is stated in the Constitution that that is an obligation. That is often taken as some kind of belief that what we need to do is, in the short term, keep employer contributions down, even if the unfunded liability of the system is amortized off into the future, and it costs you more to amortize that liability. The interesting thing about this, the phrase that ended up in the Constitution, was it didn't come in with Prop 162, the Pension Protection Act. That was a reaction to Governor Wilson's late funding of CalPERS that caused all that commotion in the early 90s. This came in 1984. Those of you who were around then will remember there was 1984 when California pension funds were first allowed to invest fully in the equity markets. And this was language that went along with that amendment to the Constitution that allowed us to fully invest in the markets. This was a phrase that was entirely meant to restrain trustees from gambling in the equity markets. That's literally what was discussed in the legislature at the time, that there was this fear that you would go to the casino, if you will, in the stock market and push all your chips into, and that's also where diversification comes from. So minimizing employer contributions essentially was meant to trigger in trust fiduciaries' minds that you should not be all in at the casino of the public markets without exercising prudent judgment and the oversight that you're supposed to do. That's what it came from. We talk a lot about intergenerational equity. Certainly something, this is the don't kick the can down the road to our children in funding issues. Certainly makes sense. It's a good policy. It's a good philosophy. It's not a fiduciary responsibility. You don't have a fiduciary responsibility to generations or to taxpayers. That's somebody else's responsibility. That's someone who's in the plan design area. Legislators, for example, the voters. Those are not this board's fundamental fiduciary responsibilities. ESG goals that have no economic link to the economic capability of this plan to pay its obligations when due. These are not within your fiduciary responsibilities to achieve because it violates the exclusive benefit rule. you're not using assets in this instance for the exclusive benefit of the members. You're trying to accomplish another goal. Now, that was then, this is now. And this is a good point about the changing circumstances. A long time ago, pre-tobacco divestment, maybe even pre-South Africa divestment, there were issues relating to so-called ESG items that did not have an economic component. You could not identify impact on the plan from engaging in certain activities such as a divestment, for example. For example, in South Africa, if you had no assets in South Africa, would it make sense for the system to sign on to some pronouncement that the United States should be out of investments in South Africa? The Labor Department has come up with a pretty good discussion for ERISA plans, and we use that as an example here on ESG issues. And when is it appropriate for trustees to consider environmental, social, and governance issues in stewarding the assets of their systems? And it's what we call a costlessness test. Essentially, you're supposed to determine whether or not making that decision, that ESG decision, whether the net impact of that, net of cost, net of tracking error, net of administrative issues, is comparable in risk and return to not making that decision. And that's how you're supposed to evaluate these things. Other things that are not fiduciary, but are within your ability to take into consideration are satisfying the legislature. It's not your obligation to satisfy the legislature or to necessarily promote California or even to defend defined benefit plans. There are sometimes linkage, economic linkage, financial linkage between the interests, the long-term profitability interests of this system and some of those areas. That's what we need to identify. We need to identify where is the economic component for this plan when those kind of issues arise. So how do we help design, how do we take these fiduciary responsibilities and design a plan that will get us through these various issues? We start with an interested board. That doesn't mean that what some may think it means, that you're interested in the subject matter. It means that the public has decided that here in California, this board and other public retirement boards should be made up of people who have an interest in the system. So we have members of the system. This is not the Ontario teachers. You know, the Ontario teachers example is you have independent people sitting as board members stewarding the assets of the system. The design in California is very different. The design is that we're going to have people who are constitutional officers. We're going to have who have an interest in the state. We have people who are members of the system. We have retiree. We have a seat for a retiree member. And so that's what we're calling an interested board as opposed to a disinterested board. And we start with that, and we start with your exercising collective judgment together, developing your superior knowledge, relying on the delegated responsibilities, monitoring those delegations through those reports that you're terrified to look at. And that's how this is designed. Harry.
If I could just interject. At some point, I would love for you, you've referenced the delegated authority. At some point, maybe not even today, but you can make note of it. At what point, how and when does a board evaluate the delegated authority, and how and when does a board know that it's found that right balance of what those delegated authorities would be? Because you've referenced that on numerous occasions, and I think it's important for us to hear from you at some point, your thinking, your firm's thinking on that issue. Okay, if you make note, thank you.
That's a good thing. And you know, you have a rather robust policy manual and other policies that talk about the delegation, but then you are going to have to keep reviewing that and determining whether that's meeting the needs that you have for decision-making purposes. That's really what it's about. Do you feel there's going to be an instinctual feel among the board that on any given issue that your delegatees, if you will, are presenting to you enough information in enough depth that you feel like you're making an informed decision. And you're going to collectively make a determination that you're satisfied with what you're getting, you're not satisfied, you want to tweak it, you want to improve it, you want to add a component to it. But it's going to be based on a collective judgment that you're going to make. We can talk about that further. Focusing on the goal, and I'm really going to roll that back to that slide of board responsibilities for a moment. Focusing on that goal is absolutely critical. So every time one of these issues, if you want to do, when somebody wants to put a traffic light out here on Capitol or something, they have to file a traffic impact report or an environmental impact report or something like that. What you need every time you're making one of these decisions in your head is you've got to have a fiduciary impact report. You got to say, how does this align with my fundamental fiduciary responsibility? You're going to need to establish priorities and shared values. We talked a lot this morning about shared definitions. I think it would be useful to have an expression of shared values as well and make sure we're all on that same page. Again, I won't harp on it. Due process, due diligence, absolutely critical to conduct as a fiduciary. And then, of course, we do this. The public wants us to do it in an open and transparent way where your decisions are made here, the material is aired, the public can comment on it. A few other things that I want to put on the table for you. We call 2008, 2009, whatever we want to call that Great Recession, we call that a fat tail event. We had 200-year disasters between the dot-com bust and the Great Recession in the space of 10 years. Part of the fiduciary responsibility that you have is to try to anticipate these type of events and possibly do some stress testing. We had the audit review, for example, yesterday with the audit committee about their work plan. We know that increased contributions to many of our employers, many of our employer districts, is going to cause financial hardship to some of them. It would be very useful to stress test those districts, for example, and try to determine what's going to happen. Is there a way that we can encourage them and help teach them how to prepare for those increased contributions that come down the pipe? There is a role for STRS to be involved in that, to protect the ability to bring in the contributions that you fought hard to get legislative support for. Last couple of points on here is avoiding undue influences and conflicts of interest. We're in a public fishbowl here. We're in Sacramento. The legislature's down the street. There are political pressures that are always brought to bear for those of us who work in the public arena. You need to resist that and resist imposing on investment staff, for example, directions that are not neutral and not based on merit, but based on the preferences of some political pressure that may come to bear on you in your role as a trustee. And ultimately, resist reverse engineering the results. Don't get an idea of where you want to be and then cause staff and others to work their way to you. Let it percolate up in terms of results. I did have another picture in there. Above all, keep your balance. That's why the decision is made here, not like the New York State Controller, one person making all the trust decisions. This is a collective board that has to work collectively and cooperatively, as the chair said this morning. We work best even if we don't disagree, even if we don't agree on everything. If there are disagreements, it works best collectively that we get those together and come to a consensus. So that's where I'd like to stop in terms of the talking head part of this right now. And I'd like to move, if you will, into some of our scenarios and engage with the board on some of your thoughts about how you weigh these things. And maybe, Sandra, I've talked enough for a while. You want to roll out scenario number one? Forgive the long text of this. That's why we sent them to you ahead of time. But let's just read through this briefly. I'm sorry, Tom.
So I had one question as you were talking. Everything you said really resonated well with me. But I wanted to zero in on it a little bit more. You said the efficient market theory is pretty well established as the kind of as being within the prudent. If you adopt the efficient market theory, you're working as a prudent fiduciary. So since 2008, 2009, there's been a lot of rethinking about the efficient market theory. The fact that correlations came to one and are tighter now. There's also been a lot of thinking about examining portfolios for diversification by type of risk across both equity and private assets or things like that. So how would you capsulize what the law now protects as, yes, if you're adopting this flavor of the efficient market theory, you're within the prudent man rule?
I just want to clarify. I think what I heard Harvey say was that he was talking about modern portfolio theory and diversification of portfolios, which includes some principles about efficient markets or some assumptions about efficient markets. But you're right. There's been a lot of thinking lately about whether modern portfolio theory still provides the right guardrail, the right guidepost for going forward. I think that's a good question for your investment staff. As far as things that I,
Should we be revisiting that, in terms of other?
we're lawyers and we're not portfolio strategists. Maybe Harvey, you can speak differently to it, but I mean, there did come a point where it was pretty clear that modern portfolio theory, because of the success of many large pools of capital using it, when Yale started to excel, Harvard started to excel beyond other or similar pooled investments, it started to become the common theme that this was the way to do it. I
wouldn't characterize the Yale method as following the modern portfolio theory or the efficient market.
Yeah, he had his own version about diversification, but the use of alternative assets and to make sure that you are using a variety of asset classes and approaches to trading and getting gains. So, I think there came a point where maybe the deep professionals who were in it probably could still find all kinds of subtle differences in the way different people thought about it, but it became clear in the core that was in the main what people were doing and was the sensible thing, especially as compared to what was done before, where alternative assets were considered just not necessarily an appropriate part of lots of kinds of portfolios. I really do think it's an appropriate question for investment staff. I'm a layman in that regard as to what is the new standard, and at least from, I haven't seen anything emerge in any reading that I would kind of do that says this is the common thought. But then again, I wouldn't expect you to look to your counsel actually for what that is. I mean, I think you're engaged in the right question, like being aware that there's a lot of change in thought about how portfolios are constructed now is, that's one of these prevailing, circumstantial changes that are happening, a wave that's happening now that you want to stay in touch with and ask for information about so you're using the right guideposts.
Because there isn't a safe harbor for how it was done 20 years ago. So it's changed, and correlations have certainly changed, and how to achieve correlate, non-correlated portfolio diversification has changed remarkably. And so the point is that the board needs to stay up on that and put its professionals to the test and question those assumptions, constantly question those assumptions that have been made.
Okay, thanks.
Before we go to the scenarios, Mr. Rosenstiel.
I just want to, I think what Tom's asking is a really interesting and important issue, but the language in the state constitution, to the extent that that's guidance for us, I think is pretty broad. It never says modern portfolio theory. It says that members of the retirement board shall diversify the investments of the system so as to minimize the risk of loss and to maximize the rate of return. So, what the theory is about how to do that may evolve, and it may have changed as a result of what happened in the financial crisis, but it still seems to be a relevant kind of guideline, just perhaps reinterpreted with experience by the investment world.
So
I just respond to Paul,
Yeah.
it's just the question within that, do go the Yale college endowment portfolio theory because it's a permanent portfolio, or have maybe half your assets be illiquid, or do you continue to have rely on efficient equity markets for your returns? It's okay. And I don't know whether the courts have spoken to that as modern portfolio theory.
Yeah, I think this is a good conversation, one that we probably can continue, outside, at another time, because I think, diversification in 2015 looks very different than it did in 1995, different than it did in 75. What does it look like in 2025? What are the asset classes going to look like? Clearly, everyone thought they were diversified in 2008. No one was. We know what the results were. So from a fiduciary responsibility, sort of connect those dots, is what does it mean to be a fiduciary and understand and ask the right questions, to probe our staff, to probe our consultants. So I think all of these comments are, in the field of fiduciary duty and responsibility. I also think we're going to go to your scenario right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
The first scenario is one where the board is considering a proposal to buy and hold $20 billion in a 30-year private corporate bond issuance to finance desalination plants in California, bringing water to this drought-stricken state. CalSTRS would be the sole holder of the bonds. The bonds would be secured and repaid by fees generated by the completed projects starting in the 7th year. The investment office estimates that the annualized return on the bonds over 30 years would be 4.75%, and the bonds would receive a BBB- rating. 3 groups have approached the board about the proposal. A labor alliance asked the board to approve the proposal to promote job growth, improve overall economic climate in the state, and which would inure to CalSTRS' long-term security by showing how the defined benefit plan can enrich local economies. A consortium of school districts has asked the board to reject the proposal because of the risk the investment will impede the system's ability to achieve the assumed rate of return, thus triggering possible increases in district contributions and school bond rating downgrades. And the California Chamber of Commerce has asked the board to approve the proposal because it will increase the stock prices of many Fortune 500 companies in California and other companies in which CalSTRS invests, causing a positive effect on CalSTRS' equity portfolio. So this is rich with a number of considerations and people urging you to think one way or another about this investment. And
So let's talk about these 3 groups that have approached, and let's ask the chair, which of these, if any of these considerations, are fiduciary considerations?
My first thoughts, Mr. Lederman, would be my observation that the Chamber and Labor are aligned on the same side of the argument.
Josh should have struck it down.
Which is not, it's in California, it definitely is, but historically, it doesn't need to necessarily be that way. In my ideal world, it doesn't have to be that way.
Actually, on desalinization, they do agree.
They do, yeah. In fact, all kidding aside, it really doesn't, we don't need to be that way, but, the other observation is it's a triple B minus rating. I would look to policy, whether or not that's within the policy range relative to the types of investments we would make in fixed income instruments. I would reference that. That would be my starting point. If the policy supported that type of investment in fixed income, I would then probe from there.
Well, let me ask Ms. Dillon, would you let the policy get in the way of this boon to the state of California?
Boone to the state of California?
The desalinization, where, I mean, other than yesterday, we're out of water.
I don't think we can.
You're bound by the policy.
For the circumstances that are outlined here, yes. I would say the low return and the low rating. For me,
Would
overweights the
anybody
other
seize upon
three.
this as an opportunity and suggest that maybe you don't be bound by your policy to be able to take advantage of this opportunity? You're gonna bring water to the thirsty state of California. Rich?
Not at that rate of return. I mean, it's the risk is, if it's rated that way, you should get a lot more money for it. And that seems to me that's our first responsibility, is to make sure we're getting a decent rate of return for the risk that we're engendering. If we could get a decent rate of return, and one of the pluses was that you had all these other benefits. But it appears that the rate of return for the risk being taken is not appropriate.
And for this exercise, I just want to let my colleagues know that Mr. Lederman and Ms. Poe have complete control of acknowledging and recognizing people. So if you want to be recognized, just raise your hand and they'll call on you. I'm
Thank you. I mean, we may even call on you if you don't raise your hand. Not gonna wait for you to raise your hand. I'm having a hard enough time just staying in the chair and not being up there with you. So. Tom?
But this is a non-starter just because of the size of the investment. I mean, that's
Too much in one pot?
Yeah.
Maybe there's a secondary market. Is there a secondary market for this? You could lay this off on others, somebody talked this morning about showing leadership. Where's the leadership here, Tom?
Well, I mean, let's be clear, the first thing, I think the project's probably, given the circumstances, be a lot of pressure on us to do the project. But the right answer would be, you need to structure a better business deal before we can do the project, right? We might go to our folks and say, we'd like to figure out a way to do this. But part of it would be, okay, we're not gonna take all 20 billion. We're gonna offload some of the risk to somebody else. There's a half a dozen ways you might be able to structure this that would make it acceptable to us. The circumstances here, I don't, my
To make
judgment is.
it financially
Yeah,
acceptable.
financially, and partially not. But I would think that we would ask staff to work really hard to see if there's a decent way. We just recently had a flip side of that with the Cerberus thing, right? Is there a financially good way to allow you to meet the otherwise laudable goals that might be out there? It just doesn't appear to me at this point that that's right, given the scenario you've outlined.
Paul?
So first of all, I think Tom's right. I mean, if the size is that and there's no market, it's a non-starter. But I think you have to start by saying, what asset class are we talking about here? Because we have different return expectations for different asset classes. We don't have an expectation of 7.5% for everything. So I'm not really sure what asset class this is. This could be infrastructure. This could be just, corporate debt. It's investment grade at triple B minus, but if it's corporate debt, triple B minus is fairly risky. It's very long term, which means that we tend on a fixed income basis to want some kind of inflation adjustment if we go long term. So my concern is I just don't see that it fits into our asset allocation and meets anywhere near probably what our benchmark expectations are for whatever asset class we decide to put this in.
Yeah, I have the same impressions. It's like, which bucket does it go into? It's triple B, and frankly, it looks too much like California's project, right? I mean, literally, if you look at our desalination in California, it was triple B, went to the State Lands Commission, it went to the California Pollution Control Financing Authority. It barely hung in there at triple B. The cost of that program in California went from 300 million to close to $1 billion. They didn't need originally state financing, and then they needed about $700 million in support from the state, well, for private activity bonds to finance it. So we have a real life example, and it's for, as Tom pointed out, it's for a huge amount for very low return. So even though it's outside, initially I'd be concerned about policy, just when you do further consideration and you look at desalination and how it blew up in Tampa, I'd be very concerned.
Any similarity between this scenario and the one you just described is purely coincidental.
But I think other examples would be instructive.
That's good. Well, but Tom, this morning you said something about firing a shot across the bow on a policy statement or something, I think like that, when we were talking about sustainability and maybe on climate change, something like that. Is that something that we ought to consider in considering this investment? Say, you know what? We're going into this because we think this is important for the state's economy and for the state of, for the people who live here. And even if we have to lay off 3/4 of it, why don't we go for it?
Okay, so put the size of this apart, because that, in relying on being able to remarket, which we don't do. I mean, we're not an underwriter or investment bank. So I was suggesting something quite different, I think. And that is that because we're so influential as an investor, we could occasionally take a step that is relatively small in terms of impact to our portfolio, and yet because of the principle articulated and the fact that we took the step, it would cause ripples in the investment and in the corporate governance world. And the example I used was, just sort of on our own motion, divesting thermal coal, so that a corporate director would say, "Oh, a smart investor is doing this, even though there aren't students camping on their doorstep or the legislator making it." And in that case, a policy preference could be pretty benign in terms of investment return, but have a significant effect. And that is something I would welcome doing. Doing something that has a material impact on and measurable impact on our portfolio returns, I think you step outside the bounds of what a prudent fiduciary could do.
So part of the responsibility then might include taking a stand that has no financial impact on the plan itself, but is influential in terms of moving people towards a goal that would be favorable towards the plan. Is that the idea?
Yeah, well, particularly on environmental issues now, you have this whole issue of there is a long-term risk, maybe it's underappreciated in the market, and a lot of investors are saying, nobody's really thinking about that yet in terms of buy and sell decisions. So for us, as to 0.3% of our investment portfolio, to take a step in a fairly prominent way, so that somebody says, "Oh, one of the biggest investors in the country is really thinking about this," may be a way to nudge people into recognizing this longer-term risk, which right now I think if you did a lot of academic research, you'd say isn't there.
Everybody comfortable with that as part of what we ought to be considering? I don't hear anyone saying no. Does anybody care in this example? Anybody worried about over 30 years that if it starts raining in California again, we may have stranded assets in these desalination plants? I mean, does that come into account? Santa Barbara? Yeah.
We're always gonna need water.
Guide. I'm just look. You just gave us the triple B minus rating. I mean, you would want to know. Do they have a contract? Do they have a take or pay contract? And we're getting pretty technical here, but a take or pay contract to sell the water to a water district. In which case, I wouldn't have as much concern. But if they have to sell the water each year on the open market to somebody who wants it, and knowing that it's going to be expensive water, then I would have a much greater concern. But I mean, I think those are credit risk issues that I think I would hope are embodied in the triple B minus rating, and that our investment staff would be looking at. So sure, I mean, you know, a thorough long-term credit analysis is what I think about when we talk about sustainability. So, but you know, the way this deal is structured would tell us a lot about that.
Got it. Well, why don't we go to another scenario? If I assume, Mr. Chairman, we still have a little bit of time. Let's talk about this one here. Maybe Sandra, do you mind going through this?
No problem.
Purely hypothetical. Any resemblance with
Signature-
anyone you know is...
Signature gathering has begun on a statewide voter initiative to reform public employee pensions, including CalSTRS, through a constitutional amendment in the following ways. The board may not amortize the unfunded liability of the system over a period longer than the average projected working life of current active members to promote intergenerational equity. B, if any school district certifies to the state auditor that paying its required annual contributions would threaten its programs, require teacher layoffs or furloughs, the district could decline to pay its annual contributions. And finally, school districts may opt out of CalSTRS for teachers' future benefit accruals by a majority vote of their boards. The board is considering whether or not to campaign for or against the proposed ballot initiative.
Okay. Joy, any thoughts about this one?
That's a hard one. I mean, I guess my first instinct is that it's, you know, it raises a lot of issues, a lot of some of the conflicting stakeholders, you know, with whom we work and we have to consider. I mean, there are aspects of the initiative that potentially, you know, sort of threaten our ability to be able to do what we're responsible to do as trustees. You know, on the other hand, I think it also takes into account some of the non-fiduciary but other considerations that you talked about, things like, you know, minimizing employer contributions and some of those other elements that may not fall so squarely in the pure fiduciary bucket. So that's, I guess, some of my initial observations.
So let's ask Mr. Chairman, okay to campaign for or against this ballot measure? What's wrong with that? Your colleague has an issue, we need to hear
I have
it.
an issue.
Sure, go
I have
right
an
ahead. I
issue,
defer.
Mr. Chair.
I defer.
I have an issue. Well, I think that's, and certainly I think, you know, every one of us on this board got here a different way, but I think that's the challenge is, you know, is it ever our place to campaign for or against, especially something like a ballot initiative? And I guess my visceral response is, no, that's not wearing our fiduciary hat.
Well,
That-
fortunately, the legislature has done you the favor of taking that out of your hands.
Right.
Because it doesn't let you campaign for or against ballot initiatives. Now, you can take a position in favor of a ballot initiative. You can take an official position as a board. You can provide information to the public about the pros and cons and the impact on the system, but you can't campaign and devote system assets for pro or con on that sort of thing. So that was a little bit of a trick thrown in there, but there's a lot of stuff here that could have a significant effect on the funding of the system if you have exit ramps for your employers to do that. So how would you, Ms. Dillon, what would you like the board to do when this proposition gets the signatures that it's looking for and is qualified for the ballot?
Hopefully before it ever qualifies for the ballot, we put our act together and have the education that we would need to provide to the stakeholders so that they could campaign for or against it. And this is pretty similar to what we did for the unfunded liability.
What did you do? In
We
that
did an
regard?
awful lot of education,
A lot of education.
not only for our stakeholders, but for the legislature. And then, and also media, editorial boards.
What was, and,
If two of these things happen, well, this would have a huge detrimental effect about the funding of the system, and we would have to make sure that that was well-known.
isn't this part of minimizing employer contributions if they can't pay? Don't you have an obligation?
It
To do
only
that?
increases it for those that are remaining. It's not decreasing.
What about the idea of closing the plan and, you know, that some districts could close it to, shouldn't they have the right to do that? What's the role of this board in addressing the issue of closing the plan to future future teachers?
Part of the funding of the board, part of the funding of the system is, depends on future contributions.
Does that
it
sound like
would-
intergenerational equity to you, Mr. Chairman?